I will frame my comments in three questions. The first question I want to ask is that while I agree that the coverage of China, especially on security issues, is largely unfavorable in the US, is it biased? It is one thing to say that the coverage is unfavorable. It is very different to claim that the coverage itself is biased. If biased in the sense that the coverage itself is untrue, the coverage is deliberately slanted, or the coverage conveys ideological prejudices. And when you look at the coverage itself, I would say that probably the coverage is unfavorable, but not necessarily biased. Let me explain why. First of all, I would say that in many cases, Chinese actions themselves cannot be defended. The Chinese actions themselves are at fault. If you look at escalation, either in South China Sea or East China Sea, then China can be held at fault in many instances. So that's one. So it will be very hard to justify Chinese action in American coverage. The second problem with this is that the coverage itself, when I look at the coverage, it's not necessarily deliberately biased, but it's not properly balanced. That is, when you look at the assignment of blame, China gets more blame than the others. More specifically, when you look at South China Sea, of course, Chinese actions may not be defensible, but Vietnamese actions and Filipino actions are not justified either. But coverage on these issues tends not to give enough blame, to assign enough blame to the other parties. In the same way in the coverage of Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands. But the most problematic aspect of coverage is that such coverage lacks depth and sufficient context. Covering security issues is a very difficult job. In many instances, you've got to go back very far into history. And unfortunately, reporters do not have the expertise, and newspaper does not have the space. If you want to sufficiently explain the background of a historical territorial dispute, you need not just one page, you probably need 5, 6 pages in the newspaper, and that clearly is not possible. And I would also here throw in another inherent disadvantage China has, that is its size. In covering territorial disputes or security disputes, being big is a disadvantage because people throughout the world have a sympathy for the underdog. Being the top dog, you're going to get the blame. And China is not the only victim of this inherent human bias. When you look at coverage of Russia in its dispute with Georgia, Russia gets blamed for most of the problems in this dispute, even though when you look at actual actions, the Georgian government in 2008 was not exactly blameless. Finally, I want to defend Western reporters in covering China. You have to imagine, you have to sympathize with the environment they work in. Their phones are tapped, they are followed, their sources are harassed. It is very hard if you're a normal human being working in that environment not to have some resentment against a government which makes your life, professional life, very, very miserable. And despite all of this, based on my own experience and based on the experience of most of my colleagues with Western reporters, they do as good a job as they possibly can. They do not necessarily deliberately distort facts. I would blame them for the lack of time, for the pressure of the deadline, and for just the complexity of the issues they deal with. So this is the first first question I want to ask. The second question I want to ask is that, of course, even if we acknowledge that the coverage of China on security issues is unfavorable, does it actually matter a great deal in terms of policy? Does unfavorable coverage of China influence American foreign policy? Here I would say, thank God, only to a very, very limited degree. By and large, American policy toward China is much less affected by unfavorable coverage than the most of us think. Because the obvious discrepancy we have on this issue is that if we believe the influence of unfavorable media coverage on American foreign policy toward China, then U.S.-China relationship would have been in much worse shape. When you look at the perception of China as a potential enemy, when you look at unfavorable coverage of China's security, economy, human rights issues, then you say, how can we justify the current engagement policy of many administrations? So, because when you look at what such coverage actually does, you will say, the coverage of China is targeted at a very thin slice of American population. I would say probably the 1% of the entire U.S. population, because as Tom noted, coverage of security issues is concentrated in elite newspapers. Their circulation no more than 3 million. If you are generous, perhaps no more than 6 million. And that's about 2% of the U.S. population and maybe 5% of the U.S. adult population. That's the elite group. The masses simply do not care about this. Most Americans get their news from TV, not from elite newspapers. And when we talk about this thin slice of U.S. population, fortunately, they are very well informed. And negative coverage of China does not necessarily influence what they think. Coverage does have one effect, that is to make China look particularly bad on Capitol Hill. What that means is that the executive branch has a much tougher job managing its China policy. But at the end of the day, the executive branch does succeed in maintaining a proper balance of trying to respond to congressional pressure while maintaining a sensible policy toward China. And the last question I want to ask is that, is there anything we can do about this? Obviously, the Chinese government is aware of the need to build a better public image in the U.S. And it has a very ambitious program. Its Chinese phrase is not exactly well chosen. It's called 大外宣, literally translated as a big foreign propaganda. I think the last thing China needs is propaganda directed overseas. Its audience is similarly poorly chosen. In Beijing, somehow Chinese officials believe that it needs to educate the wider public. I would say that good luck, because this is a demographic that is so busy with their daily lives, that is so poorly informed about their own country. I would say it is very difficult to educate 95% of the American population. I'm not being elitist. I'm being very realist in this case. And I would say a much better approach would be focused on the other two options. One is to reach out to American journalists, to Western journalists. The minimal thing the Chinese government can do is to make their lives in China a lot easier. Stop doing things that will antagonize them, just on the level of being a fellow human being. But more importantly, try to educate them, to provide them not official lines, but objective background briefing. These issues are very complex. Territorial issues. Give them as much objective analysis or background briefing as possible. That way, it makes their life, make their work easier, so that in covering these issues, they can bring in third-party objective assessment. The other thing the Chinese government can do is try to avoid doing things that further exacerbate its image abroad. Because in many of these instances, Chinese government tends to do things that are not exactly helpful. When you look at Diaoyu and South China Sea, the kind of things that are being said, and so on and so forth. So I would say that this conference touches on a very important topic. The only thing I wish is that it would take this would taking place in Beijing, not in not at USC. Thank you.